Welcome back and many thanks for staying with us right here on NTV Weekend Edition. With Uganda and Tanzania inching towards petroleum production, Uganda's parliament is set to amend provisions of the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. This is intended to ensure seamless implementation of the East African Crude Oil Pipeline activities. To help us appreciate which laws need to be amended and in what way is DENIS KAKEMBO, a managing partner with Cristal Advocates who have actually studied extensively the oil laws. He joins me right now in studio. A very good evening, Mr. KAKEMBO. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Romeo, for inviting me in once again.
Mr. KAKEMBO, let's kick off with a summary of the laws that need to be amended to ensure that there is seamless implementation of the oil activities within the Albertan region. Okay.
First and foremost, there are three laws which are going to be discussed by Parliament. As at the end of this week, two have already been tabled before Parliament. And those laws which have been tabled before Parliament include the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Bill and the Public Finance Management Amendment Bill 2001. What is pending, which we also expect should shortly hit the floor of the House, is the Income Tax Amendment Bill. Now, the reason why these laws are being tabled before the House is to ensure that the deliberations of the oil contracts and negotiations that the oil companies and government entered into are reflected in the provisions of the law, and essentially that is the reason why those laws are coming before, before the House. Now, in more detail, the East African Crude Oil Pipeline bill is going to regulate the project activities of the East African Pipeline. And the pipeline, as you might all be aware, is that pipe which is going to evacuate Uganda's crude oil from the production facilities all the way to Tanga. Now, the Public Finance Management Act is intended to enable the Uganda National Oil Company have the ability to meet its financial obligations. The reason why it's being amended is because when you look at the current provisions of the law, there's what they call a petroleum fund. So all the proceeds which the Uganda National Oil Company would earn in the current framework of the law would have to be taken to the petroleum fund, and then Parliament would have to appropriate. But that would complicate its financing. So what the Public Finance Management Bill is intended to do is to give UNOC the ability to retain some proceeds of the sale of crude oil, which they can use to meet its day-to-day obligations in terms of meeting its financing obligations for running the activities of the oil and gas projects in Uganda.
We also do know that, Mr. KAKEMBO, that most of the laws that we need to change are actually having a lot to do with tax and financial measures that we need to ensure that we get a fair shake in the production process. Do you believe that we've actually learned lessons from the previous negotiations we've had as a country?
Yes. Actually, when you look at the Income Tax Amendment Bill, it reflects a compromise that both the government and the oil companies were able to strike out after long protracted discussions.
Yes, KAKEMBO.
One of the reasons why 2 years ago there was a breakdown in relationships was essentially around tax. And in particular, when you look at the Income Tax Amendment Bill, there was an issue that oil companies raised that it was not fair for them to pay income taxes at the commencement of oil production, even though they were not in a profitable position. When you look at the Income Tax Amendment Bill, it's interesting how both the government and the oil companies were able to strike out a compromise, because the compromise is in twofold. Firstly, the cap that enables oil companies to pay as little taxes as is possible at commencement of production has been relaxed, which would enable them recover their investment much earlier and then make the Uganda project more attractive and commercially viable. But on the other hand, the government has also been given the opportunity to rake in more income taxes if at all oil prices increase. So if oil prices go around beyond $75 per barrel, government will recoup more taxes, which wasn't the situation before. And it's quite interesting that both the parties were able to strike out that compromise to move the project forward.
Here is the $64,000 question, Mr. KAKEMBO. The government of Uganda is also insisting that the firm owning the East African Crude Oil Pipeline should be incorporated in Uganda for tax purposes, among other reasons. Do you think this is a prudent measure, KAKEMBO?
Yes, actually, probably to put that in better perspective, That was one of the issues that dragged the negotiations. The government had insisted that the company which is going to hold the East African Crude Oil pipeline must be incorporated locally. The oil companies were not entirely comfortable with that because for purposes of unlocking financing, UK and London being the financial hub of the world, it makes a lot more sense. So to break the deadlock, what was essentially agreed and what you'll also find in the income tax, rather the East African Crude Oil pipeline bill, which has been tabled before Parliament, is that this pipeline company is going to be incorporated in the UK, but it's going to be a branch in Uganda and Tanzania. But to ensure that the branch is tax resident so that Uganda has the ability to tax all its activities, the management and effective control of the pipeline company is going to be exercised in Uganda. That way, even if it's not incorporated locally, the government is still able to achieve the objective of ensuring that it's resident for tax purposes here, but also not compromising the arm of the oil companies to be established in a financial hub or location of the world in London in the UK.
Mr. Kakembo, finally, if you could advise Cabinet and by extension our legislators or members of Parliament on how to amend these laws, how should we proceed?
First and foremost, the thought process of arriving at these laws essentially derives from the negotiations, the protracted negotiations that both the government and the oil companies have had. So everything which is reflected in the laws is not out of terms with the well-crafted negotiations terms that were thought out by both the government and the oil companies. So in my view, I don't think the provisions which are raised in the law are contentious, and the parliamentarians should have the benefit of doubt that the government negotiators and the oil company negotiators have done a very wonderful job for the last so many years in arriving at a win-win position, and it would really be nice if Parliament, of course they have to scrutinize the provisions of the law, but by and large it's a reflection of the thought process that is shown in the agreements that the oil companies and government have come up with. So it would be nice if these laws are passed at the earliest, because if you pass them at the earliest, the project, I think, is at a stage of financial closure. So to give confidence to international investors, international financials, the export credit agencies that it's worthwhile spending money financing Uganda's oil and gas project, it helps if we have in place a complete legislative framework. And that legislative framework is contained in the laws that have been tabled before Parliament now.
Talk of the Nation with Mr. Kakembo Dennis, Managing Partner with Cristal Advocates. Thank you very much for having made the time to speak to us.
Thanks, Randy.
And indeed, you're still watching NTV Weekend Edition. We do have another break that is in the offing, but sports is up next.